Iris McKinnon had never imagined that 17 years of life could lead to this moment. She sat on the hard wooden floor of the last wagon in the convoy, her thin blanket pulled tight around her shoulders as the desert wind howled through the canvas covering. The year was 1878, and the Arizona Territory stretched endlessly around their small group of hopeful settlers, each family dreaming of a better life somewhere beyond the horizon. The sickness had started 3 days ago. Old Mrs. Henderson was the first to fall ill, followed quickly by 2 of the younger children. The word cholera spread through the convoy faster than wildfire, and with it came a fear that made people do terrible things. Iris had volunteered to help tend the sick, using the nursing skills her mother had taught her before consumption. Took both her parents 2 winters back. She had no family left, no money, and no prospects except the vague promise of work as a seamstress in the California settlement they were heading toward. But now, as she listened to the hushed conversations outside the wagon, she began to understand that her kindness might cost her everything. "She's been around the sick ones every day," whispered Mrs. Patterson, her voice carrying clearly in the thin desert air. "What if she's carrying the disease? What if she spreads it to the rest of us?" "The girl's got no family to speak for her," came another voice, this one belonging to Mr. Crawford, the convoy's elected leader. "We can't risk the lives of everyone for one orphan." Iris pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from crying out. She felt perfectly healthy. Her forehead was cool, her stomach settled, and she had shown none of the symptoms that had claimed. 3 lives already. But fear, she was learning, could make people blind to reason. She lay awake all that night, listening to the desert sounds and trying to convince herself that surely they wouldn't abandon her. These were good Christian people, weren't they? They had prayers every evening and shared their meager supplies when times got tough. But as the hours passed and she heard more whispered conversations, the truth settled over her like a heavy blanket dot when morning came. Iris woke to silence, the kind of silence that makes your heart stop beating for just a moment. She sat up slowly, her body stiff from sleeping on the wagon floor, and listened for the usual sounds of a camp waking up. There should have been the crackle of cook fires being started, the lowing of oxen being prepared for another day's journey, the voices of children complaining about the early hour. Instead, there was only the wind. With trembling fingers, she pushed aside the canvas flap and looked out. The sight that greeted her made her stomach drop to her feet. The camp was gone. Not a single wagon remained. The fire pits were cold and scattered with sand. Even the wagon she had been sleeping in was nothing more than a broken shell, its wheels removed, its contents stripped away. They had taken everything useful and left her with nothing. Iris climbed down from the wagon bed on shaking legs. The desert stretched in all directions, endless and unforgiving under the pale morning sky. To the east, she could see the distant mountains, their peaks purple and mysterious in the dawn light. To the west, more desert, more emptiness than she had ever imagined possible. Her throat was already dry, and she had no water except for a small ceramic cup that someone had apparently forgotten in their hurry to leave. There was no food, no supplies, no protection from the sun that was already beginning to heat the air around her. She wore only her simple cotton dress, now dusty and torn from weeks of hard travel, and her mother's thin shawl for several minutes. She simply stood there, unable to fully understand what had happened. The convoy had been her whole world for the past 2 months. These people had been her companions, her only hope for survival in this vast wilderness. And now they had left her to die. The realization hit her like a physical blow. They had left her to die. But Iris McKinnon had not survived 17 years as an orphan by giving up easily. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, straightened her shoulders, and began to think. The wagon tracks were still visible in the sandy soil, heading southwest toward the distant mountains. If she followed them, perhaps she could catch up. Perhaps she could prove to them that she was healthy, that their fears were unfounded. She began to walk. The first hour wasn't so bad. The morning air was cool, and her anger gave her strength. She would show them, she decided. She would prove that she was strong enough to survive anything they could throw at her. The wagon tracks were easy to follow. carved deep into the desert floor by the heavy wheels of 16 wagons and the hooves of dozens of oxen. But as the sun climbed higher, the situation grew more serious. The desert began to show its true nature. The air shimmered with heat waves, making the distant mountains dance like mirages. Her cotton dress, which had seemed so practical in the cooler eastern climate, now felt like it was made of fire. Every step kicked up small clouds of dust that made her cough and stung her eyes. By midday, she had to stop. There was no shade anywhere, just endless stretches of sand, scattered rocks, and strange plants with thorns that seemed designed to hurt anything that came near them. She sat on a small boulder and tried to think clearly despite the heat. That was making her head swim. The wagon tracks were still visible, but they seemed to go on forever. How far could she realistically walk with no water and no food? Already, her lips were beginning to crack, and her tongue felt thick and dry in her mouth. For the first time since waking up alone, real fear began to creep into her heart. Not the angry fear she had felt at being abandoned, but the deep, cold fear of someone who understands that death might be very close. She thought about her mother, who had always told her that a person's true character was revealed not in good times, but in the worst moments of their life. When everything goes wrong, Iris, she had said, that's when you find out who you really are. Well, everything had certainly gone wrong. But who was she, really? Was she the kind of person who would sit on this rock and wait to die? Or was she someone who would keep fighting even when the odds seemed impossible? The answer came from somewhere. Deep inside her, from a place she hadn't known existed, she was a fighter. She had survived losing her parents, survived months of traveling with strangers, survived being abandoned in the middle of nowhere. She would survive this too, somehow. Iris stood up, ignored the dizziness that made the world spin around her, and began walking again. The sun was merciless now, bearing down on her like a living thing determined to stop her. Each step became harder than the last, but she kept moving. The wagon tracks blurred in front of her eyes, but she followed them by instinct, one foot in front of the other. As the afternoon wore on, she began to understand just how vast and empty this desert really was. There were no signs of human life anywhere, no buildings or roads or even other travelers. Just rocks and sand and plants that looked like they belonged on another planet entirely. The silence was complete except for the sound of her own ragged breathing and the whisper of wind across the barren landscape. When evening finally came, bringing with it a blessed coolness, Iris had walked farther than she had ever walked in her life. But the wagon tracks continued into the gathering darkness, showing no signs of leading to civilization or water or any kind of salvation. She found a small depression between two large rocks and curled up there, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders. The desert night was surprisingly cold after the blazing heat of the day, and she shivered as she looked up at more stars than she had ever seen in her life. Tomorrow, she decided, she would keep walking. She would find water somehow, find food, find her way to safety. She had to believe that, because the alternative was too terrible to consider. But as she closed her eyes and tried to sleep, one thought kept running through her mind like a prayer. Please, let someone find me before it's too late. The second day was worse than anything Iris had ever imagined possible. She woke at dawn shivering beneath her thin shawl, her lips so cracked they bled when she tried to lick them. The small ceramic cup she had been carrying was empty, and her tongue felt like a piece of leather stuck to the roof of her mouth. The wagon tracks were still there, but they seemed fainter now, as if the desert wind was slowly erasing all evidence that other humans had ever passed this way. Iris stood up, slowly, fighting the dizziness that made the world tilt sideways, and began walking again. Each step felt like walking through thick mud, even though the ground beneath her feet was nothing but sand and scattered stones. By mid-morning, she began to see things that weren't there. A house shimmered in the distance, complete with a front porch and smoke rising from the chimney. She stumbled toward it for nearly an hour before it vanished like morning mist. Later she saw a clear blue lake surrounded by green trees, so real she could almost hear the water lapping against the shore. When she reached the spot, there was nothing but more empty desert. Her mother had told her stories about desert mirages, but experiencing them was different from hearing about them. Each false hope felt like a knife twisting in her chest, making her desperate situation even more real. The sun climbed higher, and with it came a heat that felt alive, pressing down on her like a heavy blanket made of fire. Her cotton dress was soaked with sweat, but her mouth remained bone dry. She tried to find shade behind a large rock, but even the shadows seemed to burn. It was during the hottest part of the day, when the air itself seemed to shimmer and dance, that she first smelled smoke. Real smoke, not the phantom chimney smoke from her hallucination. This was the sharp, acrid smell of burning wood mixed with something else she couldn't identify. Hope flared in her chest like a candle being lit in a dark room. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant people. Maybe it was another wagon train, or perhaps a settlement she couldn't see from her position. She changed direction, leaving the fading wagon tracks behind for the first time since her journey began. The smoke led her toward a cluster of strange trees she had never seen before, their green trunks twisted and covered with sharp thorns. As she got closer, she could see that the smoke was coming from just beyond them, rising in thin gray wisps against the brilliant blue sky. But something was wrong. The smoke wasn't the steady column you would expect from a campfire or a chimney. It was sporadic, uneven, as if whatever was burning was almost out of fuel. And there were no sounds of human activity, no voices or movement or signs of a functioning camp. Iris pushed through the thorny trees, ignoring the way they caught at her dress and scratched her arms. What she found on the other side made her heart stop. A man lay crumpled against the base of a large rock, so still she thought he might be dead. His skin was bronze-colored, and his long black hair was streaked with dirt and blood. He wore leather clothing unlike anything she had ever seen, decorated with beads and intricate patterns. An Apache, she realized with a mix of fear and fascination. She had heard stories about the Apache people from other settlers, stories that painted them as fierce warriors who attacked wagon trains and settlements, but this man wasn't attacking anyone. A dark stain covered most of his shirt, and she could see a wound in his shoulder that was still bleeding slowly. His breathing was shallow and labored, and his face was pale beneath his natural coloring. The small fire beside him had almost burned out, just a few glowing embers among the ashes. For several long moments, Iris stood frozen, unsure what to do. Everything she had been taught told her to be afraid of this man, to stay away, to keep walking and pretend she had never seen him. But everything her heart told her said something different. He was hurt, he was alone. And he was probably going to die if someone didn't help him, just like she was going to die if someone didn't help her. The realization struck her like lightning. Here were two people, both abandoned by their own kind in this merciless desert, both facing death under the same burning sun. What did it matter that his skin was a different color or that he came from a different people? In this moment, they were just two human beings who needed each other to survive. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she examined his wound. The bullet had torn through his shoulder, leaving a jagged hole that was red and inflamed around the edges. Infection, she realized. Her mother had taught her about wound care during the years. When they had taken in sick neighbors who couldn't afford a doctor, the man's eyes fluttered open as she touched his forehead. They were dark brown, almost black, and filled with pain and confusion. He tried to sit up, his hand moving instinctively toward a knife at his belt, but the movement made him gasp and fall back against the rock. "It's all right," Iris whispered, though she wasn't sure he could understand her words. "I'm not going to hurt you. I want to help." He stared at her for a long moment, his eyes moving from her face to her torn dress to the obvious signs of her own desperate condition. She could see him trying to make sense of what he was seeing. A white woman, alone in the desert, offering help instead of running away in fear. Iris looked around the small camp. There was a water container made from what looked like an animal's stomach, nearly empty but still holding a few precious drops. A leather pouch that might contain food. And most importantly, the knowledge that someone who had lived in this desert all his life would possess about how to survive in it. She made a decision that would change both their lives. using strips torn from the bottom of her already tattered dress. She began to clean his wound as best she could with the small amount of water they had. He watched her work, his eyes never leaving her face, as if trying to understand why she would waste her precious water on a stranger, especially a stranger from a people her own kind considered enemies. The work was difficult and messy. The wound was deeper than she had first thought, and the infection made everything more complicated. But her mother had taught her well, and her hands seemed to remember what to do, even when her mind felt clouded by thirst and exhaustion. As she worked, she began to speak softly, not really caring whether he understood her words, but hoping the sound of her voice might provide some comfort. She told him about the wagon train that had abandoned her, about walking alone for 2 days, about the mirages that had fooled her into wasting precious energy. Something in her voice seemed to calm him. His breathing became less labored, and some of the tension left his body. When she finished bandaging his wound with strips from her dress, he spoke for the first time. "Why?" The word was spoken in accented but clear English, and it held a world of questions. Why was she helping him? Why wasn't she afraid? Why would she waste her water and her strength on someone from a people her own kind considered enemies? Iris sat back on her heels and looked into his dark eyes. "Because we're both going to die out here if we don't help each other," she said simply, "and because it's the right thing to do." He studied her face for a long moment, and she could see him weighing his options. Trust this strange white woman who had appeared like a desert spirit to tend his wounds, or maintain the suspicion that had probably kept him alive for many years. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Nalnish," he said, touching his chest with one finger. "Iris," she replied, understanding that he was telling her his name. It wasn't much of an introduction, but it was a beginning. Two people from different worlds, brought together by desperation and the simple human need for companionship in the face of death. Neither of them knew what would happen next, but for the first time since waking up alone in the desert, Iris felt something she had almost forgotten. Hope. The rest of that day passed like a fever dream. Nalnish was too weak to travel far, and Iris was running on nothing but determination and the last drops of water from his container. They both knew they needed shelter before the desert night brought its bone-chilling cold, but moving seemed almost impossible. Nalnish managed to sit up against the rock, wincing with every movement. He pointed with his good arm toward a gap between two large boulders about 100 yards away. "There," he said in his careful English, "safe place." Iris looked at the distance and felt her heart sink. 100 yards might as well have been 100 miles in their condition, but she could see the wisdom in his choice. The gap would provide protection from both sun and wind, and it was partially hidden from view. If there were other dangers in this desert, human or otherwise, they would be better off out of sight. "Can you walk?" she asked. He nodded, but when he tried to stand, his legs gave out immediately. The blood loss and infection had taken more out of him than he wanted to admit. Iris was in better shape, but not by much. 2 days without water had left her weak and dizzy, and the desert sun had burned her exposed skin until it felt like fire. They made the journey together, step by painful step. Iris supported as much of his weight as she could manage, while he used his good arm to steady himself against rocks and desert plants. It took them nearly an hour to cover the short distance, and both were exhausted by the time they reached the shelter. The gap between the rocks opened into a small natural cave, barely big enough for 2 people but blessedly cool after the brutal heat of the open desert. Ancient water flow had carved the space smooth, and someone had used it as shelter before. There were old ashes from previous fires and even some dried wood stacked against one wall. "Apache hunting camp," Nalnish explained, as they settled onto the sandy floor. "My people use this place for many seasons." Iris helped him lean against the back wall of the cave, then examined his wound again. The bandages she had made from her dress were already soaked through with blood and yellowish fluid. The infection was getting worse, not better, and she could see fever beginning to glaze his eyes. "I need to clean this properly," she said, touching the edge of the bandage gently. But we don't have enough water. Nalnish was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he pointed toward the back corner of the cave. Dig there, 2 feet down. Iris looked where he was pointing and saw nothing but sandy soil. Water? Sometimes. After rain, water stays underground. Maybe dry now, maybe not. She had no choice but to try. Using a flat piece of rock as a makeshift shovel, she began to dig. The work was backbreaking, especially in her weakened condition, but after about 18 inches, the sand began to feel damp. Her heart leaped with hope. Got at 2 feet, just as Nalnish had predicted. She hit water. Not much, but enough to seep into the hole she had created, forming a small muddy pool. It wasn't clean or clear, but it was water, and right now that was more precious than gold. Let it settle, Nalnish advised. Water will clear, then safe to drink. While they waited for the muddy water to clear, he began to teach her other things. He showed her which of the desert plants could be eaten, pointing out the broad, flat paths of what he called prickly pear cactus. Cut here, scrape thorns careful, he demonstrated with his knife, using his good hand to show her the technique. Inside is water, food both, tastes sour but keeps you alive. Iris watched carefully, memorizing every detail. She had never imagined that this barren landscape could provide food and water, but Nalnish seemed to see resources everywhere. She saw only empty desert. He taught her to identify the tracks of different animals pressed into the sandy soil near their shelter. Rabbit tracks meant there might be a warren nearby. Coyote tracks meant they should be extra careful at night. Bird tracks could lead them to water sources or areas where insects gathered, which meant plants that could be eaten. Desert only looks empty, he explained, his voice growing stronger as the fever began to break thanks to the cleaner water and cooler environment. Everything here knows how to survive. Just have to learn their secrets. As evening approached and the killing heat began to fade, they shared their first real conversation. Iris told him about her parents, how they had died of consumption when she was 15, leaving her to survive on her own. She talked about the wagon train, the fear of disease that had made good people do terrible things, and the morning she woke up alone. Why you help sick people if you know they leave you? Nalnish asked. It wasn't an accusation, just curiosity about this strange white woman who seemed to think differently than others of her kind. Because it was right, Iris said simply. My mother taught me that we help people who need help. It doesn't matter if they can help us back or not, Nalnish nodded slowly. Your mother was wise, woman. Then it was his turn to share. He told her about the Mexican raiders who had attacked him and his 2 companions while they were tracking stolen horses. His friends had died in the ambush, and he had barely escaped with his life. The bullet in his shoulder came from that fight. 3 days ago, my people think I am dead, he said quietly. When I not return, they will mourn and move camp. They cannot wait, cannot search. Too dangerous with raiders in the area. Iris understood what he wasn't saying. Just like her, he had been abandoned by his own people, though in his case it was necessity rather than fear that separated him from his tribe. They were both outcasts now, dependent on each other for survival in a landscape that cared nothing for their previous lives or future plans. That night, they took turns keeping watch. Not because they expected trouble, but because Nalnish insisted it was important to maintain good habits even when you were exhausted. Desert has many dangers, he explained. Animals, weather, other people. Always better to be ready. During her watch, Iris found herself really looking at this man for the first time. The fever had broken, and his breathing was easier. The infection in his shoulder seemed to be responding to the cleaner water and better care. He was probably in his early 30s, with strong features and hands that showed the calluses of someone who lived by his skills. Rather than by luck, everything she had been taught about Apache people painted them as savage enemies of civilization. But this man had shown her nothing but kindness and wisdom. He could have taken her water and left her to die, but instead he was sharing knowledge that might keep them both alive. When morning came, they both felt stronger. The water hole had provided enough for drinking and cleaning wounds, and the prickly pear cactus had given them their first real food in days. It wasn't much, but it was enough to prove that survival was possible if they worked together. Where we go now? Iris asked as they prepared to leave their temporary shelter. Nalnish looked toward the mountains in the distance, thinking, My people move with seasons. If raiders still hunt, they go to high places, places hard to follow. I know where. How far? Maybe 5 days' walk, maybe 7 if we careful and rest much. 5 to 7 days across this desert seemed impossible, but Iris had learned that many impossible things could become possible when you had no other choice. Will they accept me? She asked quietly. It was the question that had been haunting her since she realized they would be traveling to his village. Your people, I mean. Will they let a white woman live among them? Nalnish considered this carefully. Some will say no. Some will say yes. But you saved my life, and I'm war chief. That means something. We worry about this when we get there, not before. It wasn't exactly a reassuring answer, but it was honest. And after everything she had been through, honesty meant more to her than empty promises. They gathered what supplies they could carry, filled their containers with the precious water from their small well, and prepared to face whatever came next. Two people from different worlds, bound together by circumstance and the simple human need to survive. Neither of them knew what lay ahead, but they were no longer facing it alone. The journey toward the mountains began before dawn on their 4th day together. Nalnish's shoulder was healing well enough for him to walk without support, though Iris could see he was still in considerable pain. They had managed to gather enough water and food for several days, but both knew that the real test would come during the long trek ahead. The desert looked different in the early morning light. The harsh, burning landscape of midday transformed into something almost beautiful, with purple shadows stretching between the rocks and the distant peaks painted gold by the rising sun. But Iris had learned not to trust the desert's beauty. Beneath its stunning appearance lay dangers that could kill the unwary in a dozen different ways. We follow the washes, Nalnish explained as they walked, pointing to the dry creek beds that wound between the hills. Water carved these paths through safest routes. Also, if rain comes, we know where it will flow. Iris nodded, filing away another piece of desert wisdom. Over the past few days, she had begun to understand that survival here wasn't about fighting the desert, but about learning to read its signs and work with its patterns. Everything had a reason, from the way certain plants grew near underground water to the paths that animals used to move between feeding areas. They traveled during the cooler hours, resting during the heat of midday in whatever shade they could find. The pace was slower than either would have liked, but pushing too hard would have meant exhaustion, dehydration, or worse. Nalnish had stressed the importance of patience in desert travel, and Iris was learning to trust his judgment completely. On their 2nd day of travel, they encountered their first real test. The morning had started clear and calm, but by noon, dark clouds were building over the mountains. Iris watched them with relief, thinking that rain would be a blessing after days of brutal heat. But Nalnish's reaction was completely different. Bad storm coming, he said, scanning the sky with obvious concern. We need high ground, fast. But rain would be good, wouldn't it? Iris asked. We could collect water, cool down. Nalnish was already gathering their supplies. Desert rain not like rain in other places. Comes fast, hard, turn dry wash into river in minutes. Kill everything. In path. As if to prove his point, thunder rumbled across the desert, still distant but growing closer. The wind picked up, whipping sand into their faces and making the desert plants bend and sway. Iris had never seen weather change so quickly. They climbed out of the wash they had been following, scrambling up rocky slopes that cut at their hands and knees. Behind them, the sky grew darker by the minute, and the first fat raindrops began to fall. Within moments, the gentle drops became a torrential downpour that soaked them to the skin. From their position on the hillside, they watched something that amazed and terrified Iris in equal measure. The dry wash below them, which had been nothing but sand and scattered rocks just minutes before, began to fill with water. First a trickle, then a stream, then a raging brown torrent that carried boulders like toys and uprooted entire trees. Now you see why Apache respect the desert, Nalnish said, raising his voice over the sound of rushing water and thunder. It can give life or take it away, sometimes in same moment. They huddled under a rocky overhang until the storm passed, which it did as quickly as it had come. Within an hour, the sun was shining again, but the wash below remained full of dangerous, fast-moving water that would take days to subside. The flash flood meant changing their route, adding extra days to their journey. But it also provided an unexpected benefit. The storm had filled numerous rock pools with fresh water, giving them a chance to refill their containers and even wash some of the accumulated dirt and sweat from their skin and clothes. It was while they were taking advantage of one of these water sources that they encountered their second major challenge. Iris was refilling their water containers when Nalnish suddenly grabbed her arm, pulling her behind a large boulder. His expression was tense, alert in a way she had never seen before. "What is it?" she whispered. "Other Apache," he replied quietly. "Different band. They hunt in this area." Through a gap in the rocks, Iris could see them now. 5 men on horseback, moving slowly along the ridge above them. Even from a distance, she could see they were well armed and moving with the confidence of people who knew this territory intimately. "Are they your enemies?" she asked. "Not enemies, but not friends either. They not know me, not know why I travel." With white woman. "Might think you are captive, might think I am traitor. Better they not see us." They remained hidden for what felt like hours, though it was probably less than one. The other Apache riders seemed to be tracking something, pausing frequently to examine the ground and discuss what they found. Finally, they moved on, disappearing over the next hill. "Will they come back?" Iris asked as they emerged from their hiding place. "Maybe. We change direction again, go where they not expect." The constant need to alter their route was exhausting. But Iris was beginning to understand the complexity of traveling through this landscape. It wasn't just the physical challenges of heat, cold, and lack of water. There were human dangers as well, people who might see their unusual partnership as threatening or suspicious. That night, as they sat around a small fire built in a sheltered spot between rocks, Nalnish taught her more about reading the signs that revealed who had passed through an area and when. "These tracks may be 2 days old," he said, showing her marks in the sand that looked like random scuffs to her untrained eyes, made by horses with iron shoes, not Apache horses. Maybe Mexican raiders still in area. The mention of the raiders who had nearly killed him made Iris's blood run cold. "How do you know they're not Apache horses?" "Apache horses have no iron shoes. We let hooves stay natural, makes less noise, better grip on rocks. These tracks deep, heavy. Men carrying many supplies, many weapons." As if to prove his point, they found more evidence the next morning. The remains of a small camp, hastily abandoned, with signs that the occupants had left in a hurry. Scattered supplies, a cooking pot left behind, and worst of all, bloodstains on the rocks nearby. "Travelers," Nalnish said grimly, examining the scene. "Family, maybe? Raiders found them?" Iris felt sick looking at the evidence of violence. These could have been people just like the ones in her wagon train, ordinary families trying to build a new life in the West. Now they were probably dead or worse, taken as captives to be sold in Mexican slave markets she had heard whispered about around campfires. "How many raiders?" she asked. "Maybe 8, maybe 10. Too many for us to fight. We go different way, stay far from their path." But staying away from the raiders meant going deeper into the desert, farther from the mountain. Routes Nalnish knew best. They were entering territory he had traveled through only a few times, where his knowledge was less certain and the risks were higher. It was during this detour that Iris truly began to prove herself as more than just a burden to be protected. They were following what appeared to be a game trail when Nalnish suddenly collapsed. The stress of the journey, combined with his still healing wound, had finally caught up with him. His fever returned with a vengeance, and he drifted in and out of consciousness. For the first time since they had met, Iris was the one who had to make the critical decisions. Using everything he had taught her, she found shelter in a small canyon. located a source of water, and gathered the medicinal plants he had shown her. She tended his wound, kept him hydrated, and stood watch through the long nights while he fought the fever. During his delirium, Nalnish spoke in his native language, calling out names she didn't recognize and reliving what seemed to be battles from his past. She couldn't understand his words, but she could hear the pain and loss in his voice. This strong, capable man who had saved her life was haunted by ghosts she could only imagine. On the third night of his illness, while she was changing the bandages on his shoulder, he opened his eyes and looked at her with complete awareness. "For the first time in days, you stayed," he said simply. "Of course I stayed. Where would I go? Away. Save yourself." "Many people would." Iris met his gaze steadily. "I'm not many people. And you didn't leave me to die when you could have." Something changed in his expression then, a recognition that went deeper than gratitude. She had proven herself not just as someone who could survive in the desert, but as someone who could be trusted when everything went wrong. When he was strong enough to travel again, they resumed their journey. But something was different now. He no longer made decisions for both of them and expected her to follow. Instead, he began asking for her opinions, explaining the reasoning behind different choices, treating her as a true partner rather than a responsibility. The mountains grew larger each day, and with them came new challenges. The terrain became rockier, the paths steeper. But also, for the first time since leaving the wagon train, Iris began to feel something she had almost forgotten. She began to feel strong, not just physically, though weeks of desert travel had toughened her body in ways she never would have imagined, but mentally, emotionally strong. She had survived being abandoned, learned to find water and food in a wasteland, faced down storms and raiders and the constant threat of death, and she had not only endured but helped someone else survive as well. The Apache village appeared like a mirage in the late afternoon light, tucked into a hidden valley between towering rock formations. After 8 days of traveling through some of the harshest landscape on Earth, the sight of actual human habitation made Iris's eyes fill with tears of relief. Smoke rose from cooking fires, children's voices echoed off the canyon walls, and the smell of roasting meat drifted on the warm air. But as they descended toward the settlement, Iris felt her relief transform into anxiety. During their long journey, she had grown comfortable with Nalnish, learned to trust his wisdom and rely on his knowledge. Now she was about to face an entire community of people who had every reason to view her with suspicion, fear, or outright hostility. The first person to spot them was a young boy tending goats near the canyon entrance. His eyes widened when he saw Nalnish, and he let out a shout that brought people running from all directions. Within moments, they were surrounded by Apache men, women, and children, all talking at once in rapid conversations that Iris couldn't understand. The reunion between Nalnish and his people was emotional and overwhelming. Men who had clearly given him up for dead embraced him with fierce joy, while women wept openly and children danced around him. Iris stood slightly apart, trying to make herself as small and non-threatening as possible while dozens of curious and wary eyes studied her. From head to toe, an elderly woman with silver-streaked hair and intelligent dark eyes pushed through the crowd. This was clearly someone important because the chatter died down when she approached. She looked Nalnish up and down, taking in his healing wound, his travel-worn condition, and most importantly, the white woman standing beside him. "Itzel," Nalnish said respectfully, bowing his head slightly. "My aunt, the village healer." Itzel's gaze shifted to Iris, studying her with the intensity of someone who could read stories in a person's face. She saw the sun-darkened skin, the calloused hands, the simple dress that had been mended with strips of different fabric. She saw someone who had clearly been through hardship and survived it. "This is the woman who saved your life," Itzel said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, without her, I would have died in the desert." The crowd murmured at this, some sounds approving, others skeptical. Iris couldn't understand the words, but she could read the emotions clearly enough. She was an outsider, a potential threat, someone whose presence could bring danger to their hidden sanctuary. "She cannot stay here," said a tall man with scars across his chest and arms. His English was heavily accented but clear. "White people bring soldiers, bring trouble. We cannot risk the safety of our families for one stranger." Several others nodded in agreement, and Iris felt her heart sink. After everything she and Nelnish had been through together, after all the hardships they had shared, was she going to be turned away at the last moment? But Itzel raised her hand for silence. "Bring her to my lodge," she said firmly. "I will examine her, speak with her. Then we decide." As they walked through the village, Iris was amazed by what she saw. This wasn't the primitive camp she had been expecting based on the stories told by white settlers. The dwellings were well-built and practical, designed to blend with the natural landscape while providing comfort and protection. Gardens flourished in sheltered spots, children played games that looked universal, and the whole community had an air of organization and purpose. Itzel's lodge was larger than the others, filled with hanging bundles of dried plants and the tools of a healer's trade. The old woman gestured for Iris to sit on a woven mat, then began what was clearly going to be an interrogation. "Show me your hands," Itzel said. Iris extended her hands, palms up. Itzel studied them carefully, noting the calluses, the small scars. From thorns and sharp rocks, the evidence of hard work and survival. "You tended his wound?" "Yes." "How you know to do this?" "White women not learn healing ways. My mother taught me. We were poor, couldn't afford doctors. She learned from her mother, who learned from hers. We helped neighbors who got sick or hurt." Itzel nodded approvingly. "Your mother was wise, woman." "Like Apache mothers." For the next hour, Itzel questioned Iris about everything. Her family background, her medical knowledge, her reasons for helping Nalnish, her intentions now that she had reached the village. It was thorough and sometimes uncomfortable, but Iris answered every question honestly. Finally, Itzel sat back and was quiet for a long moment. "You have healing hands," she said eventually. "I see this in how you touch plants, how you speak of tending wounds. This is gift from spirits, not something that can be taught to someone who not have natural ability. Does that mean I can stay?" "It means you have chance to prove yourself. Some people here will never accept white woman. Others might if you show you can contribute to our survival, not just take from it." Over the following weeks, Iris began to understand what Itzel meant. The village was divided in its opinion of her. Some people, especially the younger ones and those who had been helped by her growing medical skills, began to accept her as a valuable member of their community. Others remained suspicious, watching for any sign that she might betray them or bring danger to their hidden refuge. The turning point came during her third week in the village. A group of children had been playing near the canyon rim when part of the rocky edge gave way. One little girl, no more than 6 years old, fell 30 feet onto a ledge below. The village's regular climbing experts said it was too dangerous to attempt a rescue until morning, when they could organize proper ropes and equipment, but Iris had spent weeks learning to navigate treacherous desert terrain, and she could see what the others couldn't. There was a way down, difficult and dangerous, but possible for someone small and light who wasn't afraid of heights. Without waiting for permission, she began the descent. It took her nearly 2 hours to reach the injured child, using techniques she had learned during her desert journey with Nalnish. The little girl was unconscious, with a broken arm and possible internal injuries, but she was alive. Getting her back up was even more challenging. Iris had to rig a makeshift harness from strips of her own clothing, then carefully lift the child while climbing one-handed back up the cliff face. By the time she reached the top, half the village had gathered to watch, and even some of her harshest critics looked at her with new respect. The child survived, thanks to Iris's quick action and medical care. Her parents, who had been among those most opposed to having a white woman in the village, now spoke of Iris as a gift from the spirits, but acceptance didn't come overnight. Iris had to learn the language, the customs, the complex social relationships that govern village life. She made mistakes, faced criticism, and sometimes felt like giving up. But she also discovered abilities she never knew she possessed. Under Itzel's guidance, she became skilled in desert medicine, learning to identify and use plants that could heal wounds, reduce fever, and ease pain. She developed a reputation for being able to help with difficult births, treat childhood illnesses, and even perform minor surgical procedures. More importantly, she found her place in the community's daily life. She helped with food preparation, learned traditional crafts, and even began teaching some of the children basic English, which the village leaders thought might be useful in their dealings with the outside world. 6 months after her arrival, during the ceremony that marked the changing of seasons, Itzel made an announcement that surprised everyone, including Iris herself. "This woman came to us as stranger," she said, addressing the entire village. "She has proven herself healer, helper, friend. She has earned place among our people." The acceptance wasn't universal and probably never would be. But it was enough. More than enough for someone who had once been left to die alone in the desert. As Iris looked around at the faces surrounding her, some friendly, some neutral, some still suspicious but no longer hostile, she realized something that took her breath away. For the first time since her parents died, she was home. Not the place she had been born, not the life she had planned, but home nonetheless. A place where her skills were valued, where her presence made a difference, where she belonged not because of her background or her blood, but because of who she had chosen to become. And beside her, Nalnish smiled, the quiet smile of a man who had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for. Two people who had saved each other's lives in the desert had somehow managed to save each other's souls as well. The girl who had been abandoned to die had become a woman who helped others live. And in that transformation she had found not just survival, but purpose, community, and the kind of belonging that can't be inherited or bought, only earned through courage, compassion, and the willingness to keep fighting when everything seems lost.